Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. As we wrap up 2023, many of us are making plans for the new year. Maybe you're already thinking about trips you want to take or just planning your day-to-day routines. Either way, weather can play a big role in that. So we're taking a look at the forecast for next year with WRAL meteorologist Kat Campbell. Kat, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Grace.
So let's start with the context here. Obviously, we're wrapping up 2023. How did we fare weather-wise this year?
It was a very warm year for us. In fact, warmest year to date on record. We're a couple days to go in the year, so I can't officially call it the warmest year on record at RDU, but temperatures were about 2.5 degrees above normal, and that's significant for us. We have seen below normal rainfall, not by too much, and I think that's going to be changing as we head into the winter months. I think it's interesting. What we can actually do is look at the data from the year and compare it to other climate sites across the country, and our weather this year was closest to normal for Birmingham, Alabama, so it felt a little more like Birmingham than Raleigh this year here.
And that's a little bit further south, so definitely significant there. And of course, again, we're talking about this at winter time. Winter season just technically started. So what are we expecting in terms of cold temperatures and the S word that can be very polarizing? Some people love it, some people hate it, snow.
Well, I hope we get a good one this year. We're overdue for one. But, we're forecasting slightly above normal snowfall this year. And we have a whole link online with our complete WRAL winter weather forecast. What we typically see during an El Nino year is above normal precipitation for us. And that's especially during the winter months. Whether or not we can get any of the precipitation to perfectly align with the cold air to really get a nice, good snow that sticks, to be seen, but we have better odds because we at least have half of what we need, and that's the moisture. And we should have several rounds of rain coming in because the way the jet stream is set up during an El Nino. So hopefully we can get one of those to just nicely line up with a shot of some cold air, and we'll be watching that closely for you.
All right. And as we start to head into spring, obviously Groundhog Day, we'll find out whether we'll get 6 more weeks of winter. But when do we usually start to see the year warm up?
Well, the average high finally climbs into the 70s for those of you who are not excited about that S-word snow in April. So April's your time to shine, but you've got to keep in mind during the spring we have a lot of temperature volatility. So we have these big ups and downs that come with all the fronts that move through. So it's not like we see a steady 70-degree, stretch during April. Instead, we often, as we get into the early spring months, see temperatures ranging from the 50s to the 80s even.
And you mentioned in an El Nino year, we usually see more precipitation. So are we expecting a lot of rain this spring, potentially?
I think we should see that continue into at least the early spring months. There's still some uncertainty as to how long the El Nino will last into next year. So a lot of the forecast after the spring is really going to rely on that factor.
All right. Okay, Kat, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, so what is the outlook for severe weather? Because obviously here in North Carolina, we can see a lot of different kinds. You talked about before how in the spring we can see kind of that unsettled pattern as things start to warm up.
And, what a weird year it was this year in 2023. Yes. I think the two severe weather events, well, I should say there are 3 that really stand out to me. Of course, the Rocky Mount tornado, that was in July. To see an EF3 tornado in July is just unheard of around here. Then we have the Garner tornado in December, and then we had that big wind event with the 70-mile-an-hour winds that moved through Durham and caused widespread power outages during the summer. So, keep in mind severe weather can happen all throughout the year. We've certainly seen a weird year this year. As we get into the spring months, though, with above normal rainfall in the forecast, I do think that it will be active in terms of some of those strong fronts bringing some strong winds through the area. As to whether or not we'll see any tornadoes touch down, to be seen. But the spring months are typically the most active months for bad weather like that.
Right. And of course, tornadoes, you can't exactly predict them. Hurricane season, on the other hand, we do get a prediction for that. Do we have that yet? What are we kind of expecting at this point?
I'm thinking we'll get a better feel for that in February. We need to kind of see how things play out January and February in the equatorial Pacific, because that's going to give us a better feel for whether it's a El Nino or La Nina year. And it's not guaranteed that we're going to stay in this El Nino pattern. Many of them global climate models are showing perhaps that we shift to neutral, and that's kind of the in-between there. So that's a factor that we've got to watch throughout the winter months to see how things shape up for next year. But some of the early season predictions I've seen, given how warm the oceans still continue to be, at least compared to normal, is that it would be a pretty active year again.
Right, and we did have an active year last year, right?
Absolutely. Although we didn't see anything really bad here locally, we did see above normal in terms of the Atlantic as a whole.
Okay, and that obviously is the fuel if we get to that point. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, you mentioned how we saw some unusual things in terms of like having the tornado that was earlier this month and everything. Another thing I feel like was notable as we got into the later half of the year was how dry it got. I mean, we saw a lot of droughts, which obviously affects farmers, and that caused some wildfires in the western part of the state. Is there any way we can get a sense of what that threat might be like once we get later in the year?
It's still early on to really get a better feel for that. The good news is that as we get into the spring, of course, a very important season for those with agricultural interests, we should be good to go. I do not expect that this drought's going to last even into the winter months, much less this spring. So I think that the farmers should see some relief for the spring, and that's certainly going to be good news and hopefully help out the crops and the farmers. As for next fall, still too early. We'll kind of have to get a better feel for how hurricane season is looking first.
Sure. Okay. And then we talked about, obviously, this year was an El Nino year. We're waiting to see whether it's going to be El Nino or La Nina next year. Are there any other trends that we've seen over the last few years that we expect to continue?
Warming. I mean, warming of everything. Warming of the air temperature. Every year we're breaking records globally, and that's likely to continue here locally with warmer than normal temperatures continuing next year. We're also seeing warming not just of the air, but the oceans, and that's affecting our hurricane seasons. Typically, when we have these El Nino years, you can breathe a little sigh of relief. It means hurricane season's not going to be so bad. That wasn't the case this year because of just how warm the ocean was. It was so easy for things to develop and strengthen out in the Atlantic. So warmer temperatures, warmer waters are likely to continue for the foreseeable future.
Gotcha. And obviously, with the potential for warmer weather, severe weather, what can people do when it comes to preparedness? Because I think it's always important that we talk about that.
Have two ways of getting your warnings and alerts. I think that's very important. You just shouldn't rely on one way, like your phone. What happens if you have a really bad hurricane move through and it takes out some of the cell towers? You really need two ways, whether that's your phone, whether that's a television, a radio, a weather radio, anything like that. Just have two ways. And make sure you go over your plans now. You're going to be in much better shape if very suddenly severe weather hits, if you and your children, your family know exactly what to do, where to go, where to meet, how to handle those situations, so you just don't have to think about it in those moments of chaos or panic. So just go over it. Always better prepared than scared.
I like that. Thank you so much, Kat. I really appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you have a happy new year. Thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email that's waiting in your inbox every morning with local news, events, and headlines to get you ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.